Unconscious bias is one of the most silent and dangerous forces shaping human behavior because it doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't announce itself openly, it lives in the small, split-second decisions people make without realizing what's guiding them. When the black CEO stepped onto the plane, nothing he said or did caused suspicion or disrespect. What triggered the entire chain of events was simply the story others had already written in their minds. They looked at his skin color, his simple outfit, his quiet demeanor, and in an instant, their assumptions formed a picture that had nothing to do with reality. That is how unconscious bias works. It takes years of stereotypes, societal narratives, media portrayals, and unexamined beliefs, and stacks them into a mental database that shapes reactions before logic even has a chance to speak. Bias doesn't always appear as hatred or aggression. Sometimes, it looks like uncertainty. Sometimes, it sounds like, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" or "Maybe there's been a mistake." Sometimes, it stands there with a polite smile while insisting that the person standing before them cannot possibly belong where they are. In this story, the staff didn't pause to consider that the man they were challenging could be a CEO, a leader, an innovator who had built something valuable. They simply saw a black man in a VIP seat and concluded that something had gone wrong. Their minds filled in the blanks with stereotypes, not facts. And this is the tragedy of unconscious bias. People believe they are acting logically, when in reality they are following old social scripts written long before the moment at hand. In many cases, individuals who act on unconscious bias don't view themselves as prejudiced. They might even think they are fair, professional, and respectful. That's what makes unconscious bias more difficult to confront than open discrimination. Open discrimination can be identified, challenged, and punished. Unconscious bias hides behind justification. It hides behind policy. It hides behind phrases like, "We're just following procedure," or, "It's company policy," even when the same policies are bent for others without question. The flight staff may not have intended to demean the CEO, but intent does not erase impact. A person's dignity is harmed the same way whether the disrespect comes from malice or from unexamined assumptions. When we look deeper into this moment, we see how society has trained people to associate leadership with certain appearances, success with certain skin tones, and authority with certain physical traits. The CEO had earned that seat through talent, discipline, dedication, and brilliance, but unconscious bias tried to override all of that in a single instant. It's a reminder that many people, no matter how hard they work or how high they rise, must still prove themselves in situations where others are simply assumed to belong. Bias turns everyday scenarios into battles for recognition. It forces individuals to carry the burden of someone else's assumptions. Even more striking is how quickly unconscious bias can spread through a crowd. A few people begin to assume something, and suddenly others follow. Observers on the plane likely watched the situation unfold without thinking critically about why the staff had doubts in the first place. Passengers might have thought, "Maybe he really is in the wrong seat," not realizing that the only evidence they used to form that thought was appearance. Bias is contagious, it jumps from one mind to another and reinforces itself through silence and inaction. What makes this moment powerful is how calmly the CEO confronted that bias. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. His composure became a mirror, reflecting the staff's assumptions back at them. This forced them to confront something they might have preferred to ignore, their belief that someone who looked like him couldn't possibly hold a first-class ticket, much less a top-level position in a major company. His calmness made the bias visible, undeniable, and impossible to excuse. The incident shows how urgently the world needs awareness, training, and reflection. Bias doesn't disappear on its own. It dissolves when people acknowledge their assumptions, challenge their automatic reactions, and replace judgment with curiosity. It dissolves when individuals ask themselves why they question some people but not others, why some faces trigger suspicion, and why some individuals are asked to prove what others are simply granted. Bias shrinks when people commit to seeing each human being without the filter of stereotypes or inherited beliefs. The calm strength the CEO displayed in that moment was not just a reaction, it was the result of years of learning how to navigate a world where his competence was often questioned before he ever spoke. When the flight staff approached him, their tone carried uncertainty, their eyes carried doubt, and their posture suggested authority trying to correct what they believed was a mistake. But instead of responding with frustration or anger, he chose to respond with presence. He sat upright, maintained his composure, and met their suspicion with steady confidence. His calmness was not weakness, it was discipline, born from knowing that losing control would only feed the assumptions already made about him. He understood the power of responding in a way that forced others to confront the gap between who they assumed he was and who he actually was. Calm strength is often misunderstood. Many people imagine strength as loud, forceful, overpowering. But real strength shows itself in restraint, in choosing clarity over chaos, in refusing to let someone else's bias dictate your behavior. The CEO knew that the situation itself was unjust, but he also knew that the best way to expose that injustice was to let it unfold without contributing to the noise. By remaining calm, he placed the spotlight not on his reaction, but on the staff's actions. He made their assumptions visible to every watching passenger, turning their quiet whispers of doubt into questions about fairness and professionalism. His silence became louder than any argument he could have made. Every person who ever faced discrimination understands the emotional weight of these situations. The feeling of being singled out, the sting of being doubted, the subtle humiliation of being told you don't belong, these are not small pressures. They can make even the strongest individual react defensively. But the CEO had lived long enough and succeeded far enough to recognize that emotional intelligence can be more powerful than confrontation. His calmness came from self-assurance, from knowing his worth was not up for debate, from knowing that truth does not need volume to be heard. His stillness became a kind of quiet defiance, a refusal to let the moment shrink him. When the staff insisted he show his ticket again, he didn't rush or react. He moved deliberately, giving them no fuel for any narrative they might have formed about him. His patience wasn't because he accepted mistreatment, it was because he had confidence in how the truth would speak for itself. The people around him began to notice this contrast, the staff, firm and insistent, operating from assumption, and the CEO, composed and grounded, operating from self-knowledge. That contrast created a shift in the energy in the cabin. Passengers leaned in. Conversations paused. His calmness made people question why he was being challenged in the first place. Calm strength also carries an unspoken message, I know who I am. When someone is deeply aware of their own identity and value, they don't need to perform, argue, or defend themselves frantically. The CEO had lived through years of proving himself in boardrooms, negotiations, and leadership roles. He had confronted challenges far greater than a seat assignment dispute. So in that moment, he drew from a reservoir of experience that taught him that patience can reveal truth more powerfully than outrage. He understood that the staff's behavior said everything about their bias and nothing about his belonging. Another layer to his calmness was his understanding of impact. As a black leader, he carried the awareness that his reactions were often judged differently than those of others. He knew that if he raised his voice, even justifiably, it could be twisted into a stereotype. So he chose to communicate in a way that dismantled those stereotypes instead of feeding them. His calm presence became an example for every person who has ever been judged before being known. He demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is refusing to let prejudice control the narrative. His calm strength also created space for accountability. When the truth eventually came out, and the staff realized who he was, their embarrassment was magnified by how gracefully he had handled the situation. If he had reacted with anger, they could have blamed his reaction. Instead, they were forced to confront their own assumptions. His quiet dignity highlighted their misjudgment in a way that could not be dismissed or rationalized. Through his composure, the CEO showed that leadership is not only exercised in boardrooms, it is revealed in moments when one's dignity is tested. His calmness created a powerful contrast between assumption and reality, between bias and truth, between reaction and restraint. The turning point in this story arrived quietly at first, almost unnoticed, like a shift in the air that everyone senses before they fully understand what it means. The flight staff had insisted again and again that the CEO must have made a mistake, that the seat he was occupying belonged to someone more appropriate, someone they clearly assumed held greater status or importance. Passengers watched, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, wondering how the situation would unfold. The CEO remained steady, composed, offering no hint of frustration as he reached into his bag and retrieved what would soon change everything. In his hand was not just a boarding pass, it was truth in printed form, truth that would expose every assumption made about him in the past few minutes. When he handed over the ticket, he did so with calm precision, not as a challenge but as a confirmation. The staff member took it with an air of certainty, almost as if expecting to prove him wrong once and for all. But the moment their eyes landed on the designation, first class, VIP, executive priority, the certainty faded. Their expression changed, subtly but unmistakably. It was the kind of shift that happens when reality collides with a false narrative. The silence that followed was thick, nearly tangible. The passengers who had been observing leaned in. It was as if everyone could feel the balance of the moment tipping in a new direction. But the turning point did not end with the ticket. The staff asked for identification, perhaps hoping to cling to some explanation that would salvage their assumption. The CEO obliged once again, presenting his ID with the same calm grace. When they saw his name, recognized the company logo on his elite membership card, and realized they were standing before the CEO of the very corporation whose executives were frequent VIP travelers, the truth hit them with undeniable force. The person they attempted to relocate was not just a first-class passenger, he was one of the highest-ranking leaders in his industry, someone who had earned more respect and stature than any of them had imagined. This was the moment when the entire energy of the cabin shifted. The staff who moments ago carried themselves with authority now stood with hesitation. Their posture softened, their voices lowered, and their confidence dissolved. They apologized, but their words carried the weight of regret, not because of a procedural mistake, but because the truth revealed the bias underlying their actions. The passengers who had been silent began whispering among themselves, acknowledging that what they had witnessed was not an issue of seating or paperwork, it was an issue of perception. What made this turning point so powerful was not simply the revelation of the CEO's identity, but the exposure of the flawed assumptions that preceded it. The staff had treated him as someone who didn't belong based solely on appearance, not behavior. The truth forced them to confront that their judgment had been built on stereotypes, not facts. In that instant, their actions could no longer be defended as routine procedure. The contrast between how they treated him before and how they treated him after created an undeniable mirror reflecting the role that bias had played. The CEO's reaction to this shift added even more depth to the moment. He did not gloat or seek revenge. He did not raise his voice or demand compensation. He simply observed, allowing the truth to speak louder than any words he could have offered. His quiet dignity amplified the staff's discomfort, not out of malice, but because the difference in treatment before and after his identity was revealed highlighted the inconsistency in their behavior. His calm presence ensured that the real lesson of the moment could not be ignored. As the truth spread through the plane, some passengers overhearing, others understanding through context, the atmosphere transformed. Embarrassment settled on the staff. Awareness settled on the witnesses. Respect settled on the man who had endured unfair doubt with composure. And the truth exposed something deeper, that the value of a person should never depend on a title, a status, or a stereotype. The turning point showed that justice does not always arrive with noise or confrontation. Sometimes it arrives in the form of undeniable truth, revealed at the precise moment when assumptions can no longer support themselves. It showed how quickly perceptions shift when reality steps in. It revealed how fragile bias becomes when facts stand against it. And it reminded every person watching that moments like these are not just about who was right or wrong, they are about recognizing how easily one's mind can be influenced by what it expects to see instead of what is true. The shift in public perception happened almost instantly, as if a curtain had been pulled back and everyone suddenly realized they had been watching the wrong scene the entire time. When the truth came out, when the staff finally understood who the CEO really was and why he rightfully occupied that VIP seat, the energy in the cabin changed so dramatically that it felt almost physical. Moments earlier, many passengers had accepted the staff's actions without question, assuming that the man seated in first class must have been mistaken, out of place, or simply occupying a seat meant for someone else. Their silence had quietly supported the assumption that the staff knew best. But when the truth surfaced, that silence transformed into a collective awareness that something deeper had been at play from the beginning. People began exchanging glances, not with curiosity now, but with discomfort. There is something powerful about witnessing a situation where someone is treated unfairly, and then realizing that the unfairness was driven not by logic but by assumption. Passengers who had looked at the CEO with uncertainty now looked at him with respect. Those who had avoided eye contact earlier suddenly felt compelled to acknowledge him, even if silently, with a nod or a softened expression. Public perception is fragile, and this moment demonstrated how quickly it can shift when truth enters the room. The same man who moments before had been questioned and doubted was now seen as someone who belonged exactly where he was, if not more so than anyone else. The staff themselves were perhaps the most visibly changed. Their authoritative tone vanished the moment truth forced them to see the disconnect between their assumptions and reality. The confidence in their posture dropped, their gestures became hesitant, and their voices softened with apology. This is the uncomfortable part of confronting one's own bias. Once exposed, it cannot be hidden behind policy or procedure. When the staff realized their mistake, they were not simply embarrassed because they had challenged a high-ranking executive. They were confronted with the realization that their treatment of him had been based on appearance rather than facts. The sudden shift in how they approached him revealed how deeply human beings are influenced by status, recognition, and the labels they attach to people. Passengers who had been indifferent earlier began to question themselves. Why had they assumed the staff must have been right? Why had they not questioned why the man was being singled out? Why had they accepted the staff's tone as normal? These questions, though unspoken, lingered in the air. Public perception is not only about how people view others, it is also about how people view their own reactions. The moment the truth was revealed, many passengers experienced a quiet reckoning, realizing that their initial acceptance of the situation had stemmed from the same unconscious narratives that shaped the staff's actions. They had judged with their eyes, not with reason. The most fascinating aspect of the shift was how quickly respect replaced doubt. This showed how deeply society ties worth to titles, positions, and perceived success. Before knowing he was a CEO, people saw him as someone who did not belong. After learning about his status, they viewed him as someone to respect. And this shift revealed an uncomfortable truth: many people treat others not based on who they are as human beings, but based on what they represent in terms of power, influence, or prestige. It exposed the tendency to react differently depending on whether someone appears successful or ordinary. In that moment, passengers confronted the reality that respect should not depend on status. This shift also revealed how public perception can be manipulated by narratives, assumptions, and social cues. When the staff acted confidently, the passengers assumed they must be right. When the truth corrected that assumption, the passengers' perception shifted just as quickly in the opposite direction. It highlighted how easily people follow the dominant narrative without questioning it. And it showed how powerful truth is in breaking that narrative apart. The turning point also demonstrated how leadership is recognized, not demanded. The CEO didn't raise his voice or insist on special treatment. His dignity in the face of disrespect became clearer once the truth surfaced. Passengers began to see him not as a victim of an unfair moment, but as someone who embodied strength and grace. The contrast between how he behaved when doubted and how others behaved when confronted with their own bias created a profound shift in how the entire cabin perceived him. And perhaps the most important realization was that public perception is not fixed. It can be challenged, broken, and rebuilt when truth shines through. The moment the truth emerged, it exposed not only the bias of the staff but also the quiet acceptance of those who watched. It reminded everyone that perception is powerful, but truth is more powerful still. The lesson that respect should never depend on skin color or assumptions becomes painfully clear through moments like these, moments when someone's humanity is questioned before their identity is even known. Respect is supposed to be a universal starting point, the minimum every person deserves simply for existing. Yet in countless interactions, respect is something people feel entitled to give or withhold based on appearances, stereotypes, or the stories they have unconsciously absorbed about different groups of people. What happened to the CEO on that flight shows how quickly respect can be denied when someone does not fit the image of what society has conditioned people to associate with success or importance. His experience exposes the truth that for many individuals, skin color becomes the first measure used to determine how they should be spoken to, treated, or valued. Respect built on assumption is fragile. It cracks the moment those assumptions are proven wrong. In this story, the moment the staff discovered the CEO's true position, their behavior changed instantly. Their tone softened, their posture shifted, and their urgency dissolved. But that sudden shift made something very clear: the respect they were offering now was based not on his humanity, but on his status. Before they knew who he was, they doubted him. After they knew who he was, they honored him. And this reveals a harsh reality: many people treat respect as a privilege that must be earned through titles, appearances, or accomplishments, instead of recognizing it as a right that belongs to every person from the start. When respect depends on skin color, society creates an unspoken hierarchy that systematically advantages some and disadvantages others. It allows people to justify mistreating someone simply because they do not match the image of what they consider successful, educated, or worthy. The staff did not question the white passenger who was escorted to the seat without hesitation. They questioned the black man who was already sitting in it. That contrast shows that even when people believe they are acting professionally or neutrally, their actions are shaped by deeply rooted beliefs about who belongs where. This unequal distribution of respect is subtle, often invisible to those who benefit from it, but painfully obvious to those who experience it. The lesson becomes even more powerful when we look at how the CEO responded. He did not demand respect through force or anger. He carried himself with dignity from the beginning, even when that dignity was not recognized. His calm composure under pressure demonstrated that respect starts within oneself, even if others fail to see it. His behavior reminded everyone watching that true respect is not something granted by others, it is something upheld by one's own character. Yet his grace under pressure also highlighted the injustice he faced. He shouldn't have needed to hold himself together so carefully just to counteract someone else's bias. Respect should have been his starting point, not something unlocked only after his credentials were revealed. This moment teaches that genuine respect is not conditional. It should not rise and fall depending on who someone is, what they earn, how they dress, or what society thinks they represent. When respect is conditional, it creates barriers to fairness, to equality, and to basic human connection. It prevents people from seeing each other clearly, because they are filtering their perception through assumptions rather than reality. In the CEO's case, his achievements were invisible to the staff until they physically saw proof. But his humanity was present from the beginning. The fact that it took a boarding pass and an ID card for him to be treated with basic courtesy shows how far society still has to go. The lesson extends beyond the airplane cabin. It applies to workplaces where people are underestimated before they speak. It applies to schools where students are judged based on where they come from instead of their potential. It applies to everyday interactions where split-second judgments shape how people are greeted, treated, or trusted. When respect is withheld because of assumptions, it sends a silent message that some people are valued more than others. And once that message is repeated often enough, it becomes part of the culture unless actively challenged. The story urges us to look inward and ask difficult questions. Do we treat people differently based on how they look? Do we assume someone is less capable, less educated, or less deserving because they don't fit our expectations? Do we give respect freely, or do we reserve it for those we consider important? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary, because change begins with awareness. The CEO's experience serves as a mirror, reflecting the biases people often ignore or deny. It shows that respect must be rooted in humanity, not in hierarchy. The deeper message is that when respect is unconditional, it creates a world where people are valued, not judged. A world where dignity is constant, not fluctuating. A world where assumptions lose their power, and truth becomes the foundation of every interaction. Moments like this remind us that respect should not be earned by proving one's worth, it should be given because everyone has worth. This story matters in workplaces, communities, and leadership today because it exposes how bias can shape interactions in ways people often overlook, and how the smallest moments can reveal the deepest truths about a society's values. In a world that talks endlessly about equality, professionalism, and fairness, real-life situations like the one the CEO faced show that these ideals are still fragile. They remind us that progress is not just about policies or slogans, it is about everyday behavior, the subtle choices people make, and whether those choices uphold dignity or undermine it. When someone is misjudged based on appearance rather than character, it reveals that inequality still hides in places people assume are neutral or safe. And when that truth comes to light, it becomes a lesson that stretches far beyond the walls of an airplane cabin. In workplaces, this story highlights how easily talent can be overlooked when people rely on assumptions instead of open-mindedness. Many professionals, especially those from marginalized groups, find themselves needing to prove their competence repeatedly, even when their achievements far exceed expectations. The CEO's experience mirrors what countless individuals face in meetings, interviews, promotions, and daily interactions. They walk into rooms where their abilities are questioned before they speak, where others are granted the benefit of the doubt while they are required to provide evidence. This dynamic not only harms individuals, it harms organizations. Companies that allow bias to shape decision-making limit their own growth by restricting who gets opportunities, who gets heard, and who gets valued. This story becomes a powerful reminder to leaders that creating an inclusive environment is not optional, it is essential for innovation, morale, and long-term success. In communities, the story illustrates how assumptions shape the way neighbors, strangers, and institutions treat one another. Bias does not always appear in dramatic forms, often it emerges through everyday interactions. Someone might be followed in a store, spoken to disrespectfully, doubted without cause, or excluded without explanation. These small acts, when repeated across a community, create a climate of distrust and inequality. The CEO's experience shows that even when someone reaches the highest levels of success, bias does not disappear. This challenges communities to question the narratives they pass down and the attitudes they normalize. It encourages people to build spaces where respect is not conditional, where belonging is not questioned, and where diversity is recognized as a strength rather than an exception. For leaders, this incident underscores the importance of emotional intelligence, resilience, and moral clarity. Leadership is not just about guiding teams or making strategic decisions, it is about how one behaves when faced with disrespect, misunderstanding, or injustice. The CEO demonstrated leadership not by asserting authority, but by embodying dignity. His calmness transformed the situation into a lesson for everyone around him. Leaders in any field can learn from his response. True leadership is not measured by how someone behaves when honored, but by how they behave when challenged. It is about maintaining integrity in moments when it would be easier to react impulsively. It is about using every experience, even unfair ones, as an opportunity to model strength and character. The story also matters because it exposes how quickly people's perceptions can change when they learn someone's status. Before the CEO's identity was revealed, he was dismissed. After it was revealed, he was respected. This shift forces society to confront an uncomfortable truth: many people treat others not based on humanity, but based on hierarchy. This realization is essential for leaders, educators, and community builders who aim to create environments rooted in fairness. If respect is tied to titles, wealth, or power, then society remains unequal at its core. The lesson is clear: true equality cannot exist if respect is reserved for those who prove themselves. Furthermore, this story matters today because it invites self-reflection. Every person, regardless of their background, carries assumptions shaped by culture, history, and experience. These assumptions influence first impressions, decisions, and judgments. When left unexamined, they can cause harm even when harm is not intended. The CEO's experience pushes people to ask themselves whether they, too, have judged someone too quickly, spoken down to someone unfairly, or allowed stereotypes to guide their actions. Changing society begins with changing oneself, and this story provides a powerful moment of awareness that can spark that change. Lastly, the story matters because it shows that truth has power. Bias may influence actions, but truth has a way of surfacing and demanding accountability. When the staff discovered who the CEO really was, the truth dismantled their assumptions instantly. This reminds workplaces, leaders, and communities that fairness must be proactive, not reactive. People should not need to reveal their status, achievements, or identity to receive basic respect. Every interaction, no matter how small, becomes an opportunity to affirm someone's humanity rather than question it.